Welcome, everyone. I always like to start these things with a fact. Tonight's fact is more constitutional amendments have been proposed to reform or eliminate the Electoral College than any other issue. I'm April Secura, President of the League of Women Voters of Northern Portage County, and I'd like to thank you for being here tonight. The League is proud to be a nonpartisan political organization. We do not support or oppose candidates or political parties, but we do take action on vital issues of concern to our members and to the public. This election, League Ohio has endorsed Issue 1 to ban gerrymandering. We ask you to vote yes. Since 1970, the League has been advocating to abolish the Electoral College. Critics, including the League, think that it undermines democratic principles by allowing a candidate to win without the popular vote, and it disenfranchises voters by sending the message that their votes don't count. It's time to give the power back to the American people. The League has a position, and it's had it for years, and the position reads, the League of Women Voters of the United States believes that the direct popular vote method for electing the president and the vice president is essential to representative government. The League of Women Voters believes, therefore, that the Electoral College should be abolished. We support the use of the National Popular Vote Compact as one acceptable way to achieve the goal of the direct popular vote for election of the president until the abolition of the Electoral College is accomplished. LWVUS has built a framework to abolish the Electoral College, broken down in 5 phases, stretched over a course of multiple decades. It'll take some time to accomplish, but remember that when Susan B. Anthony began her campaign for women's suffrage, she took on the challenge even though she did not expect to see it realized. She knew it was important to get it started though. 14 years after her death, the 19th Amendment was passed. So let's get started on tonight's important issue, the Electoral College, a pillar of democracy or a relic of the past. Let me introduce Janice Simmons-Mortimer, Vice President of the Northern Portage County League and the Director of Democracy Dialogues, where we explore topics regarding voting, legislation, redistricting, and more. Here she is to introduce our speaker.
April. I am so thrilled to have this event tonight. It was 2020 when our league was talking about, it would be really interesting to do a whole discussion about the Electoral College. Not a whole lot of people know how it started. Not a whole lot of people know whether or not it still helps our democracy or hurts it. So this program has been literally 4 years in the making. And it was a few months ago when we were planning our previous democracy dialogue that I met our favorite professor here from Hiram College and happened to say, would you be interested in doing anything about the Electoral College? And thankfully, Professor Doug Bradabo said yes, and here we are today. So Douglas Bradabo is a professor of political science here at Hiram College. He teaches courses on American political institutions, constitutional, international, and environmental law, and the science of human happiness. He has published widely on American presidents, their presidency, and policymaking. He leads a study away course that I actually want to go on called Ancient Forests and the Great Trees to the Pacific Coast. Sounds exciting. The professor holds a PhD from the University of Maryland at College Park and a JD from Georgetown University Law School. Again, Professor Douglas Bradabo.
Good evening, folks. It's nice to see all of you. I think if we prove nothing else tonight, it's that if you want to pack a hall with hundreds of people, speaking on the Electoral College is definitely the way to do that. So I do thank you for coming out. It's great to see all of you. There will be a robust Q&A at the end, and I think The method that will be used to gather those questions will be upon cards that you can write out your questions, and they'll share them with me up here, and I'll do my darndest to try and answer them. So think of tonight's presentation as sort of unfolding in a couple of parts. And the first is a little bit of familiarization with what the Electoral College is, how it came into being, why it came into being, the circumstances around its creation, its evolution and function, and the way that it works at our present time in history. That's part one. Part two really is why I think it's a very flawed mechanism that does very little for the benefit of the country, certainly doesn't enhance our democratic culture, our society, or our institutions, and therefore I would recommend that it would be replaced with a popular vote system, ideally a ranked choice voting system for the presidency of the United States. So with that in mind, let's talk into part one here. All right, so where I'd like to start is by observing that the American people, when polled, commonly express a couple of things regarding the Electoral College. The first is that across party lines, Americans proclaim that they'd rather have a popular vote for the presidency, and they would support the abolishment of the Electoral College. That's true of Republicans and Democrats and independents. It's true of people of different ideologies, regardless of party label. But the second thing that comes through loud and clear is that they don't know what the Electoral College is or how it functions exactly. Those two things coexist. So over here on the left, you have the public asking, where is this place of the Electoral College? And then asking, is it a small liberal arts college in New England? And I can guarantee you that if you go to the National Archives website, which keeps the official website of the Electoral College, it starts with this motto: it's a process, not a place. And the question is, why and how do we have the process that we have? Now, I want to say a word here about the circumstances of the creation of the Electoral College. The framers of the Constitution were trying to do something completely novel in history. They were trying to create an executive with a lot of power who would also be accountable to the law, would not be above the law. And so they agonized mightily over how to select the President of the United States. That is, that method of selection had to be consistent with their Enlightenment sensibilities about this person being a co-equal one-third of the government, a branch in its own right, but also not being a royal figure or a tyrant, still being accountable to the law. And the method of selection had to reflect those priorities and those values. So the framers considered three methods of selection. They considered direct voting by the people. And it's worth noting that James Wilson of Pennsylvania, who was the father of the presidency, who had more to do with anybody except perhaps James Madison, with the final form of Article 2 of the Constitution, he did believe in direct popular election for the presidency of the United States, even in 1787. The second method that was proposed and discussed at the Constitutional Convention was selection by Congress, and the third was selection by the states. They ended up melding elements of all three of these together into sort of a strange mousetrap, a Rube Goldberg contraption called the Electoral College, right? What made that possible was that they could get a little support from every state. It was a pragmatic, a practical compromise, and it would then resolve the deadlock. They could end the convention and say that they had squared away the selection method for the presidency of the United States. Now, let's talk just for a second about each of these methods. And the first one, as I mentioned, was selection by the people. Well, why not do that? There were two big objections. And I'll argue that the second was every bit as important as the first. These framers were a reform caucus in action. That is, they were pushing the sensibilities of how small d democratic a democratic republic could be. They had already proposed that the entire House of Representatives be directly elected in its entirety every 2 years. They had already left to state legislative bodies an internal vote to pick the 2 senators that each state would have. The idea in the back of their mind of a direct democracy like Athens or other Greek city-states worried them, because there were times when 80,000 people met in a stadium The saber of war was rattled, and people did an impetuous, dangerous thing. They did not like that idea very much. Some of them thought maybe it was time to give people a chance to elect an executive, but others were a little skeptical. So there was this Enlightenment lingering light distrust of full direct democracy in all its aspects. But this is the second reason they rejected that, and I think it was quite rational and quite important by the sensibilities of the time. How on earth, some of the delegates asked, would we carry out a popular election from the islands off the coast of Maine to the islands off the coast of Georgia, from the eastern seaboard up into the Appalachians and far west into the Appalachians? How would we create polling places? How would we gather ballots? How would they be transported and then tabulated in any real meaningful time frame? Remember that any object could go as fast as a horse or a human, and that's all, right? This is an age before even the railroad. This argument, I think, is very important to keep in mind. Had there been modes and methods of transportation with which we are familiar today, it's not inconceivable that James Wilson, the father of Article 2 of the Constitution, might have carried the day with his argument that the people should pick the president. But of course, that did not happen. All right, secondly then, why not selection by the Congress? To almost everybody at the Philadelphia Convention, 50 plus delegates, the idea that you would have the presidency chosen by the Congress seemed very dangerous as a violation of the separation of powers. The idea would be that the Congress could say to a president, well, if you do these policies, we will give you a second term when it comes time for the election. You would have an executive hostage to a legislative branch. And although the legislative branch in our system is the sovereign, the notion was that these three branches would have to be co-equal, and they'd be capable of pushing back against one another. So this did not pass the smell test of the separation of powers for the framers. That left them with a third one, and that was the possibility of selection by the states, by state governments, probably by state legislative bodies. They were very uncomfortable with this too. They were uncomfortable because the new Constitution had sought to move the country well past the Articles of Confederation, which were a weak central government with no power to enforce laws, no power to tax, and really it wasn't a government at all. It couldn't coerce any citizen into obeying any law. Only states could enforce laws on citizens. So they looked at the idea of having this second sovereign tier of government, the states, pick the leader of the national government. They did not like that idea either. They believed that it violated the supremacy clause of the Constitution, and they believed that it would make the national executive a creature or a puppet of state political entities. So they rejected this as well. Then the question became, well, what on earth are we supposed to do? We have run out of our three prominent options. We have to have a way to pick this person. So as with so many things at the Philadelphia Convention, it was farmed out to the Committee on Unfinished Business, often called the Committee on Unfinished Matters, and there the deliberations took place. Now, when those deliberations started, there was something in the back of the minds of the framers, and in particular the members of the Committee on Unfinished Business. It was the College of Cardinals within the Catholic Church. This, I do not mean to overplay or to suggest that it was the dominant reason for the direction of the conversation within that committee, but it mattered. It was significant. They looked at this body that had since the 700s chosen the leader of the Catholic Church, that is the Pope, and they thought it could offer them some clues about what a compromise might look like if they built one. I believe today it has 234 members. That number has changed from time to time. But the idea is that a cardinal comes from a geographical place on a continent, has a constituency. The cardinal is aware perhaps of the preferences or the will of the people of that particular faith tradition who live there, but has independent judgment in voting for a candidate in a given round in the selection of someone to occupy the papacy, all right? So that was a model that had already lasted a millennium, and they thought, well, that's interesting, maybe there's something relevant that can be factored in there. Now, they did build this compromise mechanism, and what I want to do for about a minute each of 8 things is to say a word about the following 8 questions. It's about how many electors there are. Secondly, how many electors are required to win. Third, when do they vote? Fourth, how are they selected? Fifth, what are the qualifications of the electors? Sixth, who, practically speaking, are these people? Seventh, how many states attempt to bind their electors? And eighth, and finally, to the heart of the matter, what are the 2 main flaws with the Electoral College, both according to the framers' own sensibilities and to our more modern ideas about democracy? All right, with that in mind, let's talk about how many electors there are. As you well know, there are 538. This simply corresponds to the number of senators, that's 100, 2 per state, 435 members of the House, and last but not least, because of the 23rd Amendment, the District of Columbia residents there get to vote for the presidency, and if D.C. were a state, it would have 3 electoral votes, it would have 2 senators and 1 representative, all right? That's how we get the number 538. A word on the House, we haven't expanded it since 1914, so the number of constituents in each House district has quadrupled almost during that time. We're probably due to add 100 seats to the House at some point. That can be done by simple majority vote in both the House and the Senate to pass a law to be signed by a president at some point. But for now, we have 538. It takes only the stated sign preference of 270 more of those 270 or more of those electors to choose a president of the United States. It takes nothing else. It doesn't matter, as we'll see in a popular election, how many votes the candidate of one of the 2 main parties got relative to the candidate of the other 2 main parties, or to any splinter candidate. It only takes 270 electors. When that threshold is reached, the presidential election outcome is decided. Okay. Now, 48 states use a winner-take-all method to allot their electors. That is, the candidate whose party wins the popular vote in a state gets to select all of the electors from that state. There are 2 states, Nebraska and Maine. I believe Nebraska has 5 electoral votes, Maine has 4. They use what's called the district method. They count the popular vote separately in congressional districts. It's possible for each of those states to split their electoral vote, therefore, and it would look like this year the Eastern District of Nebraska, for example, with Omaha-Lincoln, is likely to vote in favor of the Democratic candidate, as I think it did 4 years ago and also 12 years ago. And therefore, Nebraska will split its electoral vote. But those are only 2 states. 48 states in the District of Columbia are winner-take-all in their allotment of electoral votes. Okay, when and how do electors vote? Electors vote on December 17th, and they vote in their respective state capitals. The votes are then transmitted to the Senate of the United States under seal, and the Senate tabulates the vote with the Vice President presiding on January 6th at 1 p.m. Now, that date has a particular resonance and significance this time around that it had not had earlier in American history, given what happened 4 years ago, and what we, I think, all hope will not rear its head again or recur. But in any case, it is only then on January 6th that an official presidential election result is known. Up until that time, constitutionally and legally speaking, we do not have an outcome. It is only then, on January 6th, that we have an outcome. Now, this is from 2016. This is in my home state of Iowa, where I grew up meeting presidential candidates of both parties because they're everywhere, every 4 years, and you can't help but meet them all one time or another. And here the electors are gathered at a table in the rotunda of the Capitol. There they are with the governor and Iowa's Secretary of State presiding. You go from one elector to another, and there are 2 questions. The first question is, how cast you your ballot for President of the United States of America? Or wording very similar to that. Second question is, how cast you your ballot for Vice President of the United States of America? It is done for each of those electors, all right? Now, Note that the 12th Amendment to the Constitution helped us avoid a very awkward situation that we faced in the administration of the second president, John Adams, which was that before the 12th Amendment, the loser of the presidential election became the vice president. And so you had mortal political enemies in the position of president and vice president trying to be in administration together. Quickly we realized this was not a great constitutional piece of architecture, so the 12th Amendment was shepherded through and it was changed. Just as a little bit of a reality check, where that's still the way that we did things, of course, we would have had President Donald Trump and President Hillary Clinton, right? Vice President Hillary Clinton. So there's a good reason there why that was altered, why that was changed. Now, I want to say a little bit more about the process of selecting electors. It is up to the political party organizations of each state, the Republican Party organization, the Democratic Party organization, as specified by state law. And so each party has in mind its slate of potential electors on November 5th, this time around. There will be a popular vote in a particular state. If the Democratic Party wins the popular vote in a winner-take-all state, then the Democratic Party gets to pick those people who serve as electors in the Electoral College. If the Republican Party wins the statewide popular vote, it gets to choose the individuals who serve as electors in the Electoral College. Now, each state's executive or governor signs a certificate of ascertainment to officially appoint those electors into the Electoral College, and that must be done by December 11th. Then the voting takes place about a week later. Then those results are certified and sealed, but they're not counted until January 6th, even though by that point we know what the count is almost certain to look like, because these are public proceedings. When electoral voting takes place in the state capitals, it's on video, it is live cast, it's on the web, it's covered in newspapers, it's broadcast on the radio. There's not secrecy to these proceedings. Okay. Now, Article 2 of the Constitution says of the electors that they cannot be federal office holders, but that's really the only stipulation or qualification provided. So what do states do? They set very basic minimal qualifications: residency of the state, citizenship as a citizen of the United States, and you must be age 18. All right, so who really are these electors then, if we were to describe them? They are party loyalists. They are people who are dyed-in-the-wool Republicans or absolutely loyal Democrats, and the notion is that they won't stray in casting their vote. You want to pick people who are going to do the bidding of the party, who are going to vote for its candidate, who will not use independent judgment. All right there, in what I just noted, we have a problem. The framers hoped that if a demagogue were to be nominated by a political party and were to even win the popular vote of the country, that the Electoral College members would use independent judgment and stop that person from becoming President of the United States. Okay? I think we know now that that won't happen. We know that these are party loyalists for both parties. You may have a tiny number stray from time to time, but could they ever stray in big enough numbers to change the election of an outcome? It would appear not. All right? So, a rhetorical question that I pose to you now that we can pick up in Q&A in just a few minutes is, if the Electoral College can't save us from a demagogue, if it's not even within its power to do that because of the way its members are chosen as party loyalists as a reward for ideological purity, then what on earth can it save us from? Exactly. The rage of the people? The temperamental fits of the people? Probably not. Probably can't save us from any particular thing. Now, that's at odds with the wishes of the framers, who believed that when state legislative bodies picked the members of the Electoral College, these would be wise, dispassionate, expert people, who would be professional politicians, who would use their seasoned judgment to say, well, the people voted this way, but I'm a professional politician and I have the national interest in mind and I know better. I'm going to short-circuit the process and people can't have what they want. okay? Now, the second thing that I think we have to note here is we are alone out of 38 or so democratic nations in the Western democracies in having an election where we have a popular vote and then we throw it out and declare someone else to be the winner of the election, all right? To be clear, it's called having an election when you vote, and you then count votes and someone wins because they won the popular vote. That's the notion of an election, but we don't do that, all right? Now, that may have sounded less odd in 1787 to a Reform caucus in action, but to our modern ears today, the idea that, as we'll see in a minute, last time almost 160 million people went out and voted, and then we're like, yeah, you know, okay, thanks for expressing your opinion, and then we do something different. That's not consistent with our basic notions of how a democracy functions. Okay, now, what about the binding of the electors? 38 states plus DC bind their electors to obey the results of the popular vote in the state, or in the case of DC, in the district. 12 states do not legally bind their electors to stay faithful to the winner of the popular vote, but this is where things get very interesting. The Supreme Court, in a couple of cases, one in the 1970s and one just a few years ago, has indicated that states can bind electors however they want to bind them, all right? There is a website out there that I encourage you to go look at for something that is called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Here is the idea of that reform project. It is that a identically worded law is passed state by state, and what it says is that when it reaches enough states to total 270 electoral votes, it enters into force, and the electors from those states must vote for the winner of the national popular vote, not for the winner of the popular vote in each respective separate state. Okay? So, which states have passed this? We'll take a look at that in a moment. Right now, they total 209 electoral votes altogether, a little over 38% of the total of the Electoral College, and about 77% of the electoral votes, 270, needed to give the compact legal force. Now, what's fascinating here is you have 5 small states that have passed this law: Delaware, Hawaii, Maine, Rhode Island, and Vermont. You have 9 medium-sized states: Colorado, Connecticut, Maryland, Massachusetts, Minnesota, New Jersey, New Mexico, Oregon, and Washington. You have 3 big states: California, Illinois, and New York. Now, a number of states are actively discussing it, and at least one house of a state legislative body has voted on this law in those states. Those are Arkansas, Arizona, Michigan, Nevada, and North Carolina. It's also just now starting to come up in Oklahoma. My understanding is that one of the 2 Republican-dominated houses of the state of Oklahoma has passed it, okay? Just a passing comment here. In my lifetime, some of these states in these categories have gone from Republican to Democrat, or Democrat to Republican, as geography and other things have shifted with respect to political party dominance. And you can see, I think, in the additional states that are considering it here, these are states with closely contested politics that may be dominated by the Republican Party in some aspects at some times, and by the Democratic Party in other aspects at other times. We can talk more about that in just a couple of minutes if you like. Now, there are 4 plans for reforming the Electoral College: the automatic plan, the proportional plan, the district plan, and the national popular election, for a whole host of reasons, and I'm happy to discuss the first 3 when we do Q&A in a bit. I don't think any of those offers us any real improvement. They're, in their own ways, equally or flawed or worse than the Electoral College itself. So what would be a plan that really would make sense in light of what we said? So far, I think it would be the National Popular Election Plan, probably with ranked choice voting, which is starting to catch on in a number of states, and which may become a pretty heated issue in our own state, on which voters ultimately have a chance to weigh in one fashion or another. Now, this opens the door to, I think, a crystallized discussion of what the huge problems with the Electoral College really are, all right? Let's talk about those. Wyoming, our least populous state, has 580,000 people, and it has the minimum number of electoral votes possible because you can never have fewer than 3 electoral votes. You always have 2 senators. You always have to have at least 1 representative, all right? So that's 1 electoral vote for each 193,000 people. California at the moment is our most populous state with a little over 39 million people. It has 54 electoral votes. That's 1 electoral vote for about each 722,000 people. All right, let's look at the math on that then. Each Wyoming citizen's vote is 3 3/4 times more powerful than each Californian's vote. We might as well say to people who live in Wyoming, you cast 3 ballots and 3/4 of a fourth. You get to vote almost 4 times each of you. People in California, you get to vote once. Is there anything democratic about that? Does that make any sense in any conceivable political system that you could design? That you create a mechanism that makes some people's votes 4 times more powerful almost than other people's votes. I would argue that that's nonsensical, right? Now, could the framers have foreseen this? Probably not. The ratio of the most populated to the least populated state in their time was probably 10.5 or 11.5 to 1, right? It's nothing like the ratios that you see now, California compared to Wyoming. That's almost what, like a 75 to 1 ratio, okay? That's amazing. Would also add that in the time of the framers, big cities passed for 30,000 people. That was the population mecca of the United States. All right, let's move over into that other column. Let's apply this to 2020. In 2020, Joe Biden won about 81.823 million votes. In the same year, in that competition, Donald Trump won about 74.2 million votes. That is, Biden won in the Electoral College 306 to 232 after winning by about 7.6 million votes nationwide. Okay? Yet, if just 21,500 votes in 3 states had fallen the other way, and those states are Georgia, Arizona, and Wisconsin, about 5,000 each in Georgia and Arizona, about 10,000 in Wisconsin, the Electoral College outcome would have gone the other way. And you would have had a president taking office who lost a popular election by over 7.5 million votes. Right. Does that make any sense? Is there any logical purpose to that? Okay? Arguably in 1787 there might have been, because we needed to have a method we could agree on and get out of the Constitutional Convention, and the slave states would only accept certain things. Okay? But we don't live in that time. We live in our own time, and we're focused on the future. All right, to sort of begin to head this to the barn, as we like to say back in Iowa, let's take a look at a few Electoral College myths. All right? Here are some of them. The first is that the Electoral College forces candidates to campaign and to win support all over the country. No, it doesn't. It forces candidates to obsess over a tiny, small subset of states, this year 7 at the most, that happen to be poised on the edge of the knife and could go either way. And the 2 parties and their candidates are catering to the bases of those 2 parties in just 7 out of 50 states and the District of Columbia. Okay? Second Electoral College myth. The Electoral College protects the smaller and more rural states. Every state has 2 senators, regardless of population. If you are really worried about small states being bossed around at the expense of the big population states, the cure is that there are always going to be 2 senators per state, right? Give small states outsized, disproportionate, one could even suggest maybe unearned and undeserved clout, but they have it. For the record, the father of the Constitution, James Madison, didn't believe every state should have 2 senators. He did not believe that. He did not propose that. He proposed a Senate based on representation according to population. Okay, third, The Electoral College would work better if electors were allocated proportionally or by congressional district. So I'm not going to go onto a tangent about these. I'll limit myself to one comment about the congressional district plan. You just saw in the news a few weeks ago, former President Trump lean on Republican officials in Nebraska, and he said, you know, why don't you just change the law or redraw the boundary for the district so it becomes Republican instead of Democratic? And to the credit of the Republican Party officials of the state of Nebraska, they said, no, we're not doing that, right? We may do it someday, but it has to not be under pressure right before an election to change the election outcome potentially, all right? But if you were to open the door to all the states having a district approach for awarding electoral votes, it would be a gerrymandering contest in every state, and the popular vote and the outcome of the presidential election would likely have nothing in common except in the rarest of occasions. All right, fourth, big cities will dominate a national popular vote. So here's a little demographic math for you. The city boundaries of the biggest 50 cities in the United States contain a population of just over 50 million people. That is, the city jurisdiction boundaries of the 50 biggest cities contain only a little over 50 million people. We are a country right now of 335 million people. That means 15% of Americans live in big cities. Okay? So I don't know if that's a particularly compelling argument. Fifth, a national popular vote would mean the end of our two-party system. I would argue probably not. If coupled with ranked choice voting, we're not going to become in Italy or in Israel with 20 political parties that each get 3% of the vote, and then you have to paste together a bunch of parties to get a coalition. You could even set a threshold in your ranked choice voting process, so you could say that unless a party reaches a threshold of 20%, right, it just doesn't get to weigh in, it doesn't count. You could do that. All right. Sixth and finally, a national popular vote would benefit one party more than another. All right. This is, I think, an argument that you will hear a lot, right? To put a very fine point on it, gosh, the Democratic Party wants to get rid of the Electoral College because it's winning the popular vote fairly consistently nationwide in presidential elections. All right. Let me point out that 7 out of 8 times, the Democratic Party most recently has won the popular vote in presidential elections. But if you go back just before that, 7 out of 8 times, the Republican Party won the popular vote in presidential elections, all right? Those are kind of mirror images of each other. But more importantly, there is this. The candidates don't campaign to win a national popular vote. They campaign in a tiny set of states, and they try to win the Electoral College vote because that's how you become president, right? Republican presidential candidates don't waste their time in California, right? Unless it's to fundraise or do one symbolic event there, right? A Democratic presidential candidate doesn't waste time in Texas, except like, I think, one event, a symbolic event around reproductive choice is what the Democratic nominee is doing there this year, right? But if you were competing for popular votes, not for electoral votes, you would run a nationwide campaign, and you would use your resources in almost all of the states, not just 7 of them, all right? And to be clear, each candidate's pouring $1 billion into 7 states. That's odd, all right? So we don't really know what a popular vote would look like if we ran a campaign aimed at winning popular votes. Okay, what are the big benefits then of a national popular election? Well, first, the United States would stop being an anti-democracy. All right, let me tell you what I mean by that. Right now, 6 of 9 Supreme Court justices have been chosen by presidents who've lost the popular vote. All right? Let's think about that for a minute. In what small d democratic country could you possibly have a court chosen by executives who lost elections when people voted? That's irrational. That makes no sense. And I would argue that it is one of those things that in the long term could destroy the country. If you have a Supreme Court committed over here to doing certain things, but popular sentiment over here is committed to other things, and the two can never be reconciled, that's a good way to destabilize a country and its politics in the long run. All right, secondly, if you want people to vote and to get out to vote, well then Republicans in California need to know that their votes matter. Democrats in Texas or Mississippi need to know that their votes matter, right? Red voters in blue states, blue voters in red states, they need to know that their vote is going to have an impact. And under the Electoral College, their votes have no impact if they live in a very partisan state. All right, third, an encouragement of ideological moderation and pragmatism. Right? One of the effects of ranked choice voting is that it rewards non-extremity. It rewards people who hew a little closer to the center, right? Because you know you could benefit from the second choice votes of people who didn't pick you first, but that marked you as their second choice because you weren't completely objectionable to them. So if you couple popular vote democracy with ranked choice voting, that's an incentive not to have the base of one party choose people out here and the base of the other party choose people out here. It's an incentive for the pressures to move to the middle. That's a very desirable, I would argue, and very good thing. In polling, it's what Americans say they want. They say they actually want parties to cut deals, to make deals, and to govern, okay, as they did up until about the last 15 years or so. All right, fourth, enhancement of presidential legitimacy. It's an awkward thing to be president and to know that you're there because of an instrument designed in 1787 that no longer needs to exist and doesn't serve a purpose, but it did serve a purpose over 200 years ago that has now gone away. And so you're president even though the people of your country rejected you. You can't claim to have a mandate. You can't claim to have support. You can only claim that the rules were written long ago, they haven't been changed, and gosh darn it, they made you the chief executive of the superpower of Earth, okay? Probably not ideal. Probably when the United States sends its president to meet with leaders of foreign countries, we want the president to have been affirmatively selected by the American people. Okay, now, here is a book by Jesse Wegman, and it is called Let the People Pick the President, The Case for Abolishing the Electoral College. This is a nice little piece of political science writing. It is a popularized book. It is not overly technical. It is a good read. It's interesting. It's fresh. It was put out right after the 2000 presidential election. He'd written almost every bit of it. All he needed was the results from that election to kind of tie up the last chapter and put the thing together, which he did. I will note that since the 2000 presidential election, which was another election, right, where you had a popular vote win or lose the White House, there have been more and more books about the Electoral College. And what I've noticed about these is that political science has gone from being fairly tolerant of the Electoral College in the late 1990s to increasingly skeptical of the Electoral College today. This book is a sort of popular example of that. Okay, I apologize for talking at you for that long, and now I want to open the floor, and please ask absolutely any sort of stuff about the Electoral College and the related things that you like, and I'll do my darndest to answer them. Thank you. Okay, so I'm just going to read these in the order that I'm given them. The first is, who is a champion of the EC these days? Anyone. What is their main argument of support? Yes. Okay, I can give you two examples here. Karl Rove, the political strategist and the mastermind of George W. Bush's presidential election victory, both the first and the second one, is very publicly visible and outspoken in support of the Electoral College, and he says, you know, no, we don't want to get rid of this because the focus on a handful of states does shift from year to year. It's not always exactly the same states, although it seems to be right now these days. And so it really does sort of test candidates from cycle to cycle on this set of states, and then the states shift a little and it tests them on that. He likes that. I mean, not to be cynical, but I have to observe that I think part of the support that Karl Rove is making there at the Electoral College is that his candidate won the first time in a while, right, with losing the popular vote but winning the presidency, and he looks fondly on that, and he sees it as something that maybe other members of his political party could do. That's my supposition, okay? Let's see, another one. I believe Jennifer Palmieri, who is a Democrat, who's been involved in both Joe Biden's and Hillary Clinton's campaigns, has said that she does not want to get rid of the Electoral College. She wants to keep it. Her first set of arguments is similar to the set of arguments made by Karl Rove, and the other is that it tests the strategic acumen and abilities of candidates and their campaigns to deploy resources, to make decisions about where candidates spend their time, what kind of events they do, and those kinds of things, right? So there are examples of both a Republican and a Democrat working in politics today and consulting who want to keep the Electoral College. I guess I'd only say one more thing. There are people out there who want to keep the Electoral College who think that maybe in the worst imaginable crisis, somehow you could get people to break from partisanship and stop someone from becoming president who had promised some sort of authoritarian takeover or dismantlement of institutions. I'm not convinced of that, but there are some people out there who argue that. Okay, so here's the next one. It says, does having the EC keep elections more secure, super close results in one state allow for more precise recounts or certifications than if we would need to catch fraud spread out all over the country? Okay, so this is a really good question. So I guess what I would say to that is, it's not like we go to only having election tabulations done on a national basis if we have a national popular vote. We still have the firewalls of state borders. Ohio still runs its election process. New York runs its. Oklahoma runs its. And so we still really have separate elections happening. We do then take the vote totals produced by all of the state mechanisms and we add them together. But it's not like there's one pool of votes across borders and an election entity is trying to count 100 million votes nationwide, irrespective of states. You still have these firewalls built into the system. I guess the thing that I would augment there is, it turns out that the time, place, and manner of elections in the Constitution is given to states. The federal government can provide guidance, like no poll taxes, no racial discrimination, and the like, right? But it turns out that in a big 330 million person country, it's a good thing to have elections run in state units and not run as one pool in a country of 330 million people. Okay, next question is, what is the process, I think it says to delete the EC. Yeah, so if we wanted to delete it, not just have it function like a popular election, which the Intervote Compact proposes, we'd have to amend the Constitution. That's not happening. Not happening, even though in the 1970s the House of Representatives voted to approve of a constitutional amendment, right? The Senate did not come along, but the House voted in favor. The problem with constitutional amendments is it takes 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, then it's sent to the states, and 3/4 of state legislative bodies must approve to amend the Constitution. Even though 70+% of Americans, across party lines and other things, approve of getting rid of the Electoral College, we're not, at least I don't think in my lifetime, going to get a constitutional amendment that makes it through the screen of 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and 3/4 of the state legislative bodies. That just is a heavy lift, and there's a reason we haven't amended the Constitution for quite some time now. Okay, next question. Given the current political climate in Congress and the Supreme Court's originalist views, what do you think would happen if the interstate compact reached a tipping point? Okay, this is a great question too. So I'm teaching a Con Law 1 class this semester, and we have read a book about originalism. Hi, Con Law 1 students, how are you? Good to see you. And I think it would be fair. They can object, and they can throw things at me if they want. I hope they won't. But I think their consensus was they became away, is it fair to say, a little skeptical of originalism? Is that a fair? Okay, all right. Meaning the following thing. Justices on the court claim to be originalists up and until originalism produces an outcome they don't like, and then they change to get the outcome that they desire. Okay, so to the Electoral College issue. The court has now declared in 2 cases that states can bind their electors how they want to bind them, and it will not get in the way. The court has said this twice. Okay? Once when the court was a progressive-leaning court in the early 1970s, and once just a few years ago when it was a court leaning to the right. Now, could an originalist bloc on the court change its methodology or change its mind when the compact goes into effect and say, oh, scratch the 2 precedents, we didn't mean it? It could. Does that automatically seem likely to me? It does not seem likely to me. It seems like their reasoning and their stated logic that is in those 2 cases would require them to go through quite some contortions to undo. It doesn't mean it's not possible. It's always possible with the court, but it strikes me as pretty unlikely given what they've said about the role of states and electors in presidential elections. Okay, hot off the presses here, folks. We have more questions. Let's see. The first question says, the role of 3/5, personhood in slave states when the founders chose the Electoral College. Yes, okay. So James Madison had very particular things in mind that he wanted the Constitution to encompass and to embody. As I said, he was a fan of representation based on population, not based on statehood. He did not want the Senate to have 2 senators per state, regardless of population. Nor did he want the 3/5 compromise, which counted slaves as 3/5 of a person for purposes of population tabulation, which augmented the House representation of the Confederacy, what would become the Confederacy, the slaveocracy at that point, the slave states, right? This warped the national politics of the 1800s all the way up through the Civil War, because you had a part of the country with not a lot of citizens, in that case, citizens/white people, right? But you had a population-inflated figure that gave them way more representatives and outsized voting power in the House because they got the benefit of counting slaves as 3/5 of a person each for population purposes. So one thing that Wakeman points out, and others do this too, who don't like the Electoral College's effects, they say, look, it warped the politics of the country all the way up to the Civil War in a way it never should have been warped. And number 2, this institution was kind of a sop or a concession to the slaveocracy and to plantation life, and so it's kind of born in very soiled circumstances, and it has that whiff about it still. I don't disagree with that. I think it does still have that whiff about it. It's one of the unsavory aspects of the creation of the Electoral College. Okay, next card says, what can we do as individuals to affect change and eliminate the EC? I think you want to look strategically at the states that are considering the interstate compact, and you want to find a way to get your state, whatever it is, whether you're living in Ohio or you're living somewhere else, you want to get it considered by the state legislature, and you want to get it sent to the governor. And it will happen, folks. It may take more than 5 years. It might take a decade. But I do believe that Americans are going to be walloped with surprise at some point in the 2030s, and I mean the first half of the 2030s, when the compact goes into effect. I think that's inevitable. I think that enough states right now are either one house already voted on it or both have, but a governor hasn't signed it, that those are going to put it right up to the 265 or so mark, and then it's just going to take one other state to get it over the finish line. I really believe that it will happen in the first half of the 2030s at the latest, but are Americans tracking this? No, they are not tracking this. They are unaware completely of it. And so it will come to them as a big surprise. But I would say try to get your state to consider it and to vote on it in the state legislative bodies. Okay, next card says, regarding ranked choice voting, it seems that it would heighten suspicion about election integrity, especially if a candidate wins a plurality in the first round but loses in subsequent rounds. Your thoughts? Yes, I think that is possible, or maybe even likely, that it can enhance suspicion. That's more of a comment on Americans and their suspicions, I think, than it is a comment on ranked choice voting and the usefulness of ranked choice voting. Having taken student groups to Australia, where you get to pick your top 10 to 13 candidates and rank them, right? And then the vote tabulation is like a national playoff sport, televised for days, right? Where they go round by round and the math comes into place. Australians don't bat an eye at that. They're like, yeah, I listed, my top 9 choices to be the next executive, right? Here, I can't imagine we would do something that extensive. You'd probably get a second choice or maybe their top 3 at the most, right? But would it, in certain quarters, enhance suspicion? I hate to say it, but I think it might, just because of the conspiracy theory-minded country that we seem to have become, I guess. That's a good question. I hope I answered it. Okay, let's see. Next question. Are independents ever chosen to be electors? Should they be? In the modern era, I don't think they are. They were chosen at times in the 1800s, particularly, I would argue, before the Civil War, where state legislative bodies essentially said, who's a wise person, right? Who's wise here in Indiana that we could put in the Electoral College, okay? But by the time you get to the Civil War, that attitude is going away, and in our own time, it's utterly extinct. It just doesn't exist. Should they be? Sure, that could be interesting. A group of independents might be more prepared to change their minds and resist a dictator, a would-be dictator. Yeah. But is there any way that I can figure out how that could happen? No, I can't figure out how that could happen because it's been turned over to party organizations and they pick partisan people to serve in the Electoral College. Next one. Do you have statistics on Hillary's popular vote win, EC loss? I have the popular vote margin of 3 million votes. I think 2.966 million votes was the popular vote margin from 2016. And the Electoral College margin was the reverse of the one between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. In other words, the two numbers in the Electoral College were just flipped, okay? So the popular vote margin for the Democratic candidate went from 3 million to 7-point-something million, but the Electoral College margin was the same, just in the opposite direction. Okay, could you give a short description of the validity or legality of the effort in 2020 to shift or change electoral votes? Yes, so starting even before Election Day, but picking up a lot of steam after Election Day in 2020, the President and a group of advisors, driven in significant measure by Rudy Giuliani, who just yesterday, by the way, the court ordered to turn over his personal wealth and possessions to the election workers in Georgia, whose lives he's ruined these years by slandering them. They won a huge victory against him and ended up taking some of his remaining wealth from him in damages. Rudy Giuliani said, doesn't matter, Mr. President, doesn't matter if you won, that doesn't matter. What we can do is we can try to pressure the political leaders in states to appoint an alternate slate of electors. We can make up pieces of paper, get them to sign them, claiming to be electors, and if we can impanel a slate of fake electors in place of the ones chosen through the duly delegated process, then we could steal an election that way, okay? That is hand in glove with several other approaches that the former president and his inner circle took, including the president getting on the phone to people like Raffensperger in Georgia and saying, I just want you to find me the 10,500 votes. I just want you to find me the votes, right? Otherwise, I could do bad things to you. You could be a criminal. I could put you in jail, or you could go to jail, or you'll be committing a crime. It happened in Arizona. It happened in other places, right? Remarkably, for the most part, these people held their ground. okay? They didn't give in. But, and I'm not going to go too far afield, what I want to say to you is, when your firewall against disaster is one guy in Georgia who had the good sense to tape record a phone call and to refuse to give in, even knowing that it would make his life a living hell, when that's your firewall to hold up your democracy, you're in a rough spot, okay? So that was one part of the effort as well, and then there were 61 or 62 court cases brought in different states in the courts. I think one of them was found to have a smidgen of merit. The other 60 were all dismissed by federal court judges. They were made up lies about fraud, about stealing ballots, about double counting votes, and a bunch of other things, but those lawsuits were all thrown out as frauds, okay? So if you put those together, it was all part of an orchestrated plot by the former president and his inner circle to do what he, to undo what he knew had happened and what witnesses in various investigations have testified, and you can read the testimony online. They've said, I told the president he lost the election. He said, yeah, I know, but, right, I don't want to not have another term, okay? And I can't admit that. And then these various frauds took hold. They failed, but it was a very close call. Okay, that's all the parts that I have. Is there any data on which party would have the most representation if we switch to ranked voting today? There's data on state elections that I'm familiar with because some states have started to adopt this. One example that comes to mind is Alaska, which has been using it for a little while now. The representative Mary Peltola, I believe is her name. I think you could say she has the term that she's now finishing up because of ranked choice voting, right? Because she was enough people's second choice that when they went to the second round, she got those second choice votes, and just mathematically was enough to put her over the top. Interestingly, I think the Washington Post just ran a data analysis today on Alaska this time around, and it seems to suggest that if polling is anywhere near accurate in Alaska, ranked choice voting will work against her this time, and she won't be the second choice of enough people, and she'll lose if she's one of the top two finishers in the first round, okay? Let's see, I believe Maine has also done this. I know less about the results in Maine. So I think it's highly situation dependent. But did it seem to produce a more centrist House candidate in Alaska? I think it did. That happened to, of course, be a Democrat. How would it cut nationally? I think it's becoming very hard to tell. I think one of the things we're going to learn in this election is that the electorate is shifting and changing, and particularly voters of color are going to be voting in slightly different patterns than they voted in past elections, right? And I think we're going to see that along other lines too, by gender and everything else. That is to say, the tectonic plates of our country are shifting politically, even generationally, and it's hard to tell en masse in the aggregate what the effect of ranked choice voting would be in a partisan way. I feel very not informed on the basis of data enough to state a concrete opinion about that, is I guess what I would probably say. Okay, those were great questions, folks. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate that, and thanks for coming out on a Wednesday evening to have this chat. I enjoyed it very much. Have yourselves a good evening. Thank you.
I too want to thank you for coming out on this evening. I hope you enjoyed today's topic as much as I did. And we, a few years ago, did a whole program on ranked choice voting within our league, but it sounds like maybe we need to do another democracy dialogue after this election, maybe in the spring, with our favorite professor again, talking more about the idea of ranked choice voting. But thank you for coming. If you have not voted, you have not too long to go here. But please, I encourage you to vote. Whatever party, whatever your position, vote not only for that presidential slot, but there's a whole slew of other races on your ballot on important issues that really will determine your everyday life. The presidency gets all the glory, but really it's those down ballot races that really impact your everyday, and I hope you are educated and informed about those. If not, I encourage you to go to vote411.org. You can look at your ballot, you can look at the candidates and how they've responded to the league, and get informed about the issues that are on your ballot. Thanks again.